Hello and welcome to another Times Radio Frontline recap with me, Philip Ingram. I'm currently the presenter of Times Radio Frontline, as you know well, but I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer and I commentate on all matters geopolitics, defence, security, cyber, terrorism and anything else people will cross my palm with silver to talk about. Genetically, I have got an opinion on everything. And I've got some great videos for you this week to have a little look at. The first one is the Kremlin's spokesperson, or their equivalent of Comical Ali, Dmitry Peskov. Have a little listen to what he has to say here.
The current administration is fundamentally different from previous ones. And of course, President Trump is strong now, strong in terms of his domestic political position. This gives him the ability to adapt his concept in line with his vision. The adjustments that we see correspond in many ways to our vision. So there is reason to hope this could be a modest guarantee that constructive joint work on finding a peaceful settlement for Ukraine at minimum can continue. The new strategy even includes an acknowledgement that NATO should stop expanding. It is mentioned as well. Indeed, the plan includes language against confrontation and in favour of dialogue, building good relations. Just as President Putin had said, that is encouraging on the one hand, but on the other, we know what happens when everything looks good on paper, yet what they call the deep state acts differently. That can happen. So it is essential to closely monitor how this concept will actually be implemented.
And this is Peskov welcoming the new United States national security strategy. Yes, I did say that right. We've got the Kremlin welcoming the US national security strategy. If ever there was something that was very strange, that's it. I never thought I would ever hear myself say that or read a national security strategy that was more pro-Russia and anti-EU and anti-NATO than the one that has just come out from the United States. Now, whether there's any substance to it, whether the strategy will be implemented or not, is a completely different matter, but it is certainly one that has caused a degree of consternation. If you haven't seen it, go find it and have a read of it. But for Petrov to be supporting it, we should be worried. And then the next clip I want to point you at is President Zelensky with the European leaders in London, and that's Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, and Chancellor Merz from Germany. Have a look at this here.
That we stand with Ukraine, and if there's to be a ceasefire, it needs to be a just and lasting ceasefire. And that's why it's so important that we repeatedly set out the principle that matters about Ukraine are for Ukraine. And we stand here to support you in the conflict and support you in the negotiations and make sure that this is a just and lasting settlement if we can get that far. But
things which are very important for today, I think unity between Europe and Ukraine, and also unity between Europe, Ukraine and the United States. There are some things which we can't manage without Americans, things which we can't manage without Europe, and that's why we need to make some important decisions.
We all support Ukraine, and we all support peace and peace negotiations to have a sustainable, a robust peace. And I think we have a lot of cards in our hands. The financing and the furniture of equipment and training programs to Ukraine, the fact that Ukraine is resisting in this war, and the fact that the Russian economy is starting to suffer, especially after our latest sanctions and the US sanctions. And now I think the main issue is the convergence between our common positions, Europeans and Ukrainians, and the US to finalize these peace negotiations and re-engage a new phase in the best possible conditions for Ukraine, for the Europeans, and for our collective security.
This could be a decisive time for all of us. So we are trying to continue our support for Ukraine, as you know. On the other hand, we are seeing these talks and negotiations in Moscow and in the US. I'm looking forward to hear from you what the outcome of these talks might be. And we are still and remain strongly behind Ukraine and giving support to your country, because we all know that this the destiny of this country is the destiny of Europe. So that's the reason why we are here, trying to figure out what we can do. And nobody should doubt on our support for Ukraine. And this is what we are firmly standing behind, and the outcome is open. I'm skeptical about some of the details which we are seeing in the documents coming from the US side, but we have to talk about that.
And in this clip, of course, we've got Zelensky calling for European unity. And this is after this meeting of the leaders of the coalition of the willing. But the interesting point that I want you to have a little look at, and go back over the clip again and look at it. Look at the faces of the European leaders. Look at the body language that there is between them. There's clearly a nervousness. There's clearly a concern. And that nervousness and concern is about the US national security strategy that's just come out. They are beginning to realize that they're going to have to stand up themselves, stand up alone, and that the United States is probably not a partner they can rely on anymore. And that is quite clearly etched across all of their faces. So I've got 3 interviews that I want you to have a look at this week. Of course, these are just clips. I would strongly recommend that you go and watch the complete interviews, because they will give you good long-form understanding of what's going on in the particular areas. But I'll start off with an old friend and colleague, Hamish de Bretton Gordon. Hamish has got a new book coming out in June called Tank Commander. We sort of recommend that at the beginning, but his other book, Chemical Warrior, is a great read, and I've known Hamish as a personal friend for many, many years. But Hamish, here, it's him and I talking about Pokrovsk and the areas that have been retaken from Ukraine. Have a look at this.
Pokrovsk it's really been, the square point. It's a real point of effort. Russia has invested a hell of a lot of military capability into it. Suggestions are 170,000 troops over the last sort of 6 months. And that is what they have been championing. And they have tried to make us believe, with all the disinformation and propaganda, if they take Pokrovsk, then they've pretty much taken the Donbass. I think, first of all, a lot of people would dispute that. And as we know, when defensive positions, if you lose one, you fall back to others. You don't just cut and run. So there are many other defensive positions to the west and sort of northeast of Pokrovsk to go back into. I think also, Russia has been telling us that they've been doing this, but it's been quite clear. I mean, only on the briefings last night from the Ukrainian MOD, they're suggesting actually that in the last few days that Ukraine has taken back about 20% of Pokrovsk, and quite apart from Russia completely holding it, actually they've lost, I think they were quoting last night, about 13 square kilometres of a town that covers about 30 square kilometres. So that is going. And also, colleague of ours, Johnny Beale at the BBC, very good thing on last night showing Ukrainian flags still flying in Pokrovsk. So I think that is, Russia is trying to, as the negotiations get really, really hot and Trump is wading in his inimitable way, Putin's trying to show Trump that actually the Ukrainian forces are about to fold in the Donbass, therefore they should have the Donbass. But actually, ground truth is not that at all. And sure, Ukraine has suffered. Sure, Pokrovsk is not the logistics hub that it used to be, but it is not, the front line has not collapsed as the Russian would have us believe.
I'm glad you brought up Donald Trump, because that's where I want to go next. He seems to be coming out and regurgitating the propaganda and the disinformation that's coming out of Moscow about the vulnerability of Donetsk, about Ukraine having to give up territory, about Ukraine should never have started a war that they couldn't win. And he seems to be coming out with Russian lines time after time after time again. What do you think is behind the language that he's using, and how important do you think it is that we listen to what he's saying and try and counter it?
I think it's quite extraordinary, and you framed it very well there, Philip. That it is bizarre. Why is our supposed ally handing all the cards to our actual enemy? It strikes me that that Trump is just desperate for a peace deal, desperate for Putin to sign the peace deal, because some of the other wars that he allegedly has stopped in the last few months have exploded again, like Cambodia and Thailand and elsewhere. So he just seems desperate. And his last plea is accept the peace deal by Christmas, otherwise I'm out of here. So I think it is very strange. I think there are two other elements to this, and I'm sure you discussed it on Frontline last week. The new US national security strategy, and the way that Europe is sort of seen as a pariah, the enemy, as it were, and obviously some incredibly far right wing rhetoric coming out of the White House, which is sort of kind of strange, suggesting that Europe is actually the problem here and not Russia. And I think we're all finding that pretty difficult to consume. So I think that is highly significant. Now, what we and how we react, it's pretty clear that this is very much up to Europe to now do the heavy lifting, and it's pretty clear that the European leaders, seem to be getting behind this. The most recent, this week, we've had Zelensky in London with the German Chancellor, French President, and also, of course, our own President and Zelensky, President, Prime Minister, even. So, and then Zelensky was off around Europe, garnering support. On the back of that, we've got a number of peace deals that seem to be buzzing around at the moment, and we're just waiting for another one, and we're just waiting for President Zelensky to present his plan. I think really, really significant. As you say, what Trump has been proposing seems to be very much what Putin is proposing. And the most interesting thing that I thought I sort of picked up coming out of Moscow over the last few days is the insistence on elections, which just strikes me. I think actually the way that Zelensky has played this gives us a little bit of hope. And what Zelensky has said, because I'm sure people are aware that under martial law in Ukraine there are no elections. There should have been elections last year because that's when Zelensky's term was up. But actually, Zelensky's been pretty smart. I think he said, "Yeah, I'm very happy to have elections," which is sort of a tick for what Putin's been calling for and what Trump's been calling for. But oh, by the way, to have an election, we've got to have a ceasefire, and to have a ceasefire, I've got to have security guarantees. So that's I'm prepared to do it soon and quickly in the next 60 days or so. So that, to me, really puts the ball back into Trump and Putin's court. If they want these elections, then actually they're going to have a ceasefire and freeze the borders where they are, not where Putin is demanding they should be redrawn to.
And Hamish and I have a good discussion about what's going on in Pokrovsk, and we try to take apart the why Russia is saying that they've captured all of it, and highlight the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is that there are large elements of Pokrovsk that nobody holds, and Russia certainly hasn't captured all of them. And the Ukrainians are having increasing success in retaking areas where they can deny the Russians coming back into it again. So Pokrovsk certainly hasn't been lost completely, no matter what we're seeing out of the Russian channels. And we're seeing this in other areas across the front line in Ukraine. So it's interesting to see that the Russians are not able to hold on to what they're saying they have captured. And this ties in with the next interview that I want to point you towards. And this is with John Luff, the head of foreign policy at the New Eurasian Strategy Centre. Have a look at his interview here.
It's just a matter of time before the US takes, these sort of longer term decisions that might relate to the number of military bases it keeps in Europe, the number of troops it keeps on the ground, these sort of things where you see a kind of material result after the proclamation of the goal that Europe needs to invest more in defense and manage the security of the continent more independently. So that's probably going to take some years. So they have to reckon with the fact that Donald Trump has 3 more years in the White House. Is he going to be a lame duck president in a year's time? And if he is, does he probably try to derive power or relevance from choosing his successor? I mean, could this be, another long drawn out form of The Apprentice? And he's, deciding between the different options. So I think that's probably the game that's in play. And maybe for the Russians, that's an unsettling one, because they can't be 100% sure that these policies being outlined now are actually going to stick, and they're going to be converted into outcomes that are measurable and indeed lasting. So I think they've got a good long way to go. Overall, I suspect their suspicion of what they perceive as a deep state in the United States is going to temper some of their current celebrations. But I think they're most definitely in celebratory mood right now. But they haven't got they haven't got good reason, I think, to celebrate their position in Ukraine, because in a sense one can say that the Ukrainians have been slowly losing this war probably for the last 2 years. I don't think you can say at the same time, paradoxically, that Russia has been winning the war. It's in this situation where it should be doing much better. It may ultimately do much better simply because Ukraine is the weaker of the two parties when you look at their resources. But it all comes down to ultimately how you fight the war, and whether the Ukrainians are in fact putting up just sufficient barriers to slow the Russians down to ultimately exhaust them. We know that Russia is still having to recruit 25,000 soldiers a month to put them into battle, because that's the number they're losing. It is becoming more expensive to recruit these soldiers, and the quality of the soldiers in many cases is very low. And we're talking about, be it ex-prisoners, people apparently fighting even in their 50s, and they're not capable of conducting, by any measure, sophisticated warfare. So that's why the Russians are not doing better. And as one commentator said to me recently, somebody who analyzes deeply the so-called Z communities, Telegram channels. So these are the sort of patriots and supporters of the war, at least probably 95% of them. This person told me, a Russian analyst told me, the overall impression from reading all these posts and watching the videos was that the Russian army doesn't really want to win this war, because the major generals, the brigade generals responsible for this operation on the ground, are quite comfortable with a war of attrition, because they're making money out of it. They don't have to take excessive risks. They can just continually bring people into battle, use them as cannon fodder, and the system kind of works. So I think there's a big question there about whether the Russian army will really be able to punch through. And possibly a sign of their perhaps the frustration in the Kremlin, or indeed even desperation, is the fact they're resorting to such a wide-scale air campaign targeting critical infrastructure, particularly energy infrastructure in Ukraine. That's an indication that they're actually not doing so well on the battlefield, much as they would like to create the impression that a whole string of towns are about to fall and the Ukrainian army is in chaos and the front is going to collapse. I don't see any sign of that right now.
On this clip, John is talking about Putin thinking that Trump's deal is too good to be true. And of course, Putin is sitting there going, I couldn't have been happier if I'd invented this myself. Of course, he did invent it himself, and he gave it to Steve Witkoff, and Steve Witkoff then released it as the White House's plan, and then told Donald Trump. It was quite clear Donald Trump hadn't been briefed beforehand, and it's quite clear Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, hadn't been briefed beforehand, because he said, this isn't our plan, and then about 20 minutes later said, oh, this is our plan. So clearly the briefing came down. Total confusion, which is not good from a geopolitical perspective. But John goes into, in this clip, something else that I think is even more interesting and ties in with what's going on at Pokrovsk and Kupiansk and elsewhere. And John talks about Russian generals not actually wanting to progress any further. They're happy sitting, making lots of money out of extorting the troops that they've got under command, by extorting anything that they can possibly generate money out of, and sending troops into the meat grinder. They're not concerned about trying to make any real progress. And that's a view that I hadn't heard beforehand. And actually, the more I think about it, the more I agree completely with what John is saying. So well worth watching that full interview. It's a good one. And then the final interview I want to point you at this week is my interview with Michael Bazirkov. Have a look at that here.
I can't even bring myself to call it a peace plan. I think it's a plan that is a Christmas present, speaking of Christmas, to Mr. Putin, because they actually love it. And to actually put in there that Ukraine should give up territory that the Russians don't even control, which of course is against its constitution, have to be forced to reduce its armed forces, to swear off of joining NATO. I think further down the list, there are things there about elections and a whole bunch of other things that is totally ridiculous and no Ukrainian president could ever sign on to. Now,
it also contravenes international law. You cannot, part of the United Nations Charter is you're not allowed to take land by force, and therefore it can't be handed over. And then it's against a number of other bits of international law to coerce a country into giving land across. And therefore, not only Vladimir Putin trying to do that, but Donald Trump, if he tries to force the Ukrainians to do it, is in contravention of various international protocols.
Yeah, and guess what else is in there is that Russia would not have to pay reparations and there would be no war crimes prosecutions. Now, what kind of signal does that last point send out to non-state actors and autocrats around the world if they can do war crimes with impunity? And, it absolutely makes me sick. When I read about a week ago, I put it in my world briefing, that Russia is actually exporting stolen Ukrainian kids that went to Russia to North Korea, to Pyongyang, to so-called camps where they've been undergoing indoctrination, including developing anti-Japanese feelings. Now, if this isn't number one, an escalation of the war, and number two, bringing the war closer to the doorstep of Asia Pacific, I don't know what is. And that should set off alarm bells in places like Seoul and Tokyo and beyond.
Well, it's interesting you say that. We've got the Americans massing forces off Venezuela. We've got the Russians have sent special advisors and clearly equipment into Venezuela to try and protect against any US action. But we've got Donald Trump, who's on one hand is trying to put pressure on Maduro in Venezuela, who's being supported by the Russians. On the other hand, seems to be supporting the Russians in what's going on in Ukraine. Where's the logic in all of this?
There is no logic. And let's remind people that things are heating up again on the Thai-Cambodian border, another theater of conflict with which Mr. Trump claims that he brought peace to. He's always said, I'm a president that ends war and doesn't start them. Well, if you look at all of the indicators in Venezuela, it looks like things are really going to heat up there. I mean, sending their largest aircraft carrier, something like 10,000 Marines already in the area. One of my theories there is that he wants to get control of the oil from Venezuela, as well as other natural resources like gold. I think this, excuse that we're stopping drugs headed for the U.S. coastlines is ridiculous. You don't put out a force like that to hit these boats, though. And that's all aside from the allegations of war crimes too, of hitting some of these boats. But yeah, it's a bizarre kind of mindset right now in Washington. I've almost given up trying to figure out what Mr. Trump's rationale is, other than trying to enrich his family, his immediate circle, perhaps the United States, the so-called homeland. But also, I think he's still gunning for some kind of Nobel Peace Prize. This is a man with a tremendous ego, with no ideology. And that so-called national security strategy looks like it was, actually, we would be complimenting 12th graders if we said they could write it. It's just so elementary and ridiculous. But it does, really move the focus of the United States, again, more to the homeland, more to the Western Hemisphere, and also to Asia Pacific. And I do believe that we are seeing a shift. And I don't know if I can credit Mr. Trump for this, but in terms of hemispheric control, Putin in this part of the world, Donald Trump in the Western Hemisphere, Xi Jinping in China. Xi Jinping in Asia Pacific, South China Sea, and so on.
And this is where Michael is talking about the Ukrainian inability to trade land for a peace deal. It's constitutionally impossible for Ukraine to do that. And he talks about in the longer interview, he talks about the difficulties that there are politically inside Ukraine, and goes into some detail. And I think the most interesting bit that Michael and I talk about here is goes into some detail about the impact of the corruption scandal that there's been in Kyiv. And Michael's living in Odessa. He can take the temperature of the Ukrainian people very easily indeed. And what he says is quite concerning about what's going on. But we're already seeing President Zelensky come out with trying to get proposals through the Ukrainian parliament to get elections, even though there's martial law, so that requires a change in constitution and other things. So Zelensky is clearly trying to wrestle a degree of control back. But actually, I found a lot of what Michael Bezerkov was saying really quite depressing. And therefore, I'd strongly recommend that you go and watch the whole interview. So that's all I've got on recap this week. As I've said, go and watch the long form versions. Go and watch all of our interviews because they're all good. We only pick a few out at random to bring a couple of points out. But thank you for watching. Remember, if you want to get exclusive access to our content early, sign up for Times Radio membership. And that'll also allow you to put questions in for me to answer on my weekly question and answer session. And of course, you can get us on your favorite podcast channels. Just search for Times Radio Frontline. Thank you. Goodbye.